in starting this inverse trig function out, I'm going to start it off just like I start off my proof. I'm going to say, I know that the sine of the sine inverse of x is x. That is the property that belongs to inverses. The sine of the sine inverse of x is x. Alright, now I want to take the derivative. Now this is going to make a little bit more sense than what the proof showed here. If you're taking the derivative of the sine of an angle, what is its derivative? The cosine of that angle, right? So it's going to be the cosine of the sine inverse of x, and then times the derivative of the angle, which happens to be the inverse, right? So it's going to be times the derivative of the inverse, which is what we want to know. And that will equal 1. So again, it's a chain rule. You're taking the derivative of the sine of the angle times the derivative of the angle itself. But again, this is what we're solving for. I said, what is d dx of sine inverse of x? So it will be that.
So if you were given like x, you could find the answer.
Yeah.
And you're plugging in to the right hand side or left hand side or both?
Right. Or the right hand side is where you'd solve from it. You could plug it into the left hand side. But you'd do the solving for the right hand side. Great question. Now, here comes the trick to it. Well, let me preface this by saying there are a lot of formulas in calculus. I think y'all will agree with that. We've had a lot of formulas in here. And you don't have a note card that you can just memorize the formulas on and go from there. I think I've told you I was given a note card when I learned calculus. And in Cal 1 and Cal 2, I was able to use that note card. It was a beautiful note card. It was about that small. And I had just the smallest handwriting on it. Had that sucker filled out. And when it got to a test, I could flip over that note card and I knew where everything was. It was a masterpiece. What happened is that I didn't learn it. I just learned where it was on my note card. I wish I'd kept that note card. But when it came time for Cal 3, I had a different professor. We didn't get to use note cards. So all that I had on my note card, I didn't have memorized. And it came back to haunt me. That's the reason why I don't let y'all use note cards in here. It's not because I'm mean. It's just a coincidence. It's because I want you to get this stuff learned. Well, anyway, in this thing about learning formulas here, I could have this formula up here memorized if I wanted to. But it's not a formula that's just repeated throughout. So actually, whenever I come to an inverse problem, I don't go back and plug in this formula because I don't have this one committed to memory. But what I do remember is that an inverse with its function is x, and I just derive it every time. I mean, it's only 2 steps, so it's not a long process, but that's what I go about doing. Now, flip forward. If you are in your book will say that the derivative of the sine inverse of x is 1 over the square root of 1 minus x squared. how are those two things the same? Because we saw this. You can't argue with me. First off, I grade your papers. But you can't argue with me. This is true. There was nothing incorrect that I did here. But guess what? The people who wrote your book, they made money off the book. So I guarantee you that they're not incorrect here. So there's got to be some kind of link between these two. Well, guess what you get to learn today? The link between the two. Let's think about what this is talking about here. This says the sine inverse of x. This is saying that you have we want to know the angle that has the sine of x. Well, let's go over here and draw it. Let's draw it in the first quadrant. Inverse. X is positive, so we're going to be in the first quadrant. That triangle right there has a sine of x. Would y'all agree with that? Alright. Let's go ahead and complete this triangle. What would be the adjacent side here? Or how could we go about figuring out the adjacent side? Pythagorean theorem. So, a squared plus x squared equals 1. So a squared equals 1 minus x squared. So a is going to be, it's on the right-hand side of the y-axis. So it's going to be the positive square root of 1 minus x squared. So this side here has a length of the square root of 1 minus x squared. Are we good here? Alright. Now, this is saying here that we want to know the cosine of the angle that has a sine inverse of x. Well, what's the cosine of this angle? The adjacent piece over 1, right?
Okay.
So the adjacent is the square root of 1 minus x squared over 1. So that's how those are the same.